Afternoon, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I introduce this award, and the Maryland Council of Problem Gambling makes the award. Let me tell you a little bit about the award. The Dr. Joseph W. Shiraki Excellence in Problem Gambling Award is presented annually by the Maryland Council on Problem Gambling. The Maryland Council on Problem Gambling, MCPG, established the Dr. Joseph W. Shiraki Excellence in Problem Gambling Award in 2011 when he passed away to honor such an amazing and tireless leader, advocate, gambling disorders, scholar practitioner, and champion of problem gambling wellness. I'm excited. Dr. Joseph W. Shiraki was my professor during my doctoral degree, and my mentor, the esteemed Joanna Franklin Roberson, who has passed away as well. Both of them worked together in the state of Maryland, champion advocacy in developing the first problem gambling treatment clinical program in our great state. So this year, we're super excited to award the Dr. Joseph W. Shiraki Excellence in Problem Gambling Award for 2022. The recipient is Anthony Parente. We are super, super excited that Anthony Parente is given this award. Let me tell you a little bit about Anthony Parente. He is an amazing advocate. He is an amazing and outstanding clinician. He has spent his whole career continuing to the present day advocating and providing clinical services for gamblers, the affected others, and the community at large. Anthony's experience is not just in the state of Maryland, but he is raising up public awareness across the United States and in other places. He is a licensed clinical professional counselor in the state of Maryland, and he is the owner of his own private practice with over 36 years of clinical services across the state of Maryland. He is also a nationally certified counselor, a master addiction counselor. He's also the internationally certified gambling counselor at the advanced level, and he has supported across these years countless numbers of clients and affected others that struggle every day with gambling, substance use disorders, and other co-occurring mental health concerns. Anthony is a board-approved clinical consultant, which is a designation in our field of someone at an advanced leadership level, and he has provided and is providing co-leadership with the Dr. Lori Rugel and the Maryland Center of Excellence on Problem Gambling, a new clinical fellows program. He also provides, and many of you may participate in, his outstanding Maryland Center of Excellence clinical consultation that is offered monthly to expand your awareness and your service delivery, as well as supporting family and others that are affected. He has a Bachelor's of Arts degree in psychology from the State University of New York at Stony Brook. He has his Master's of Arts in clinical psychology from Loyola College, which is now Loyola University of Maryland. And he has recently transitioned from teaching there. He is where he also coordinated field education for undergrads and master's level, coordinated the practitioner certificate of advanced study program in the LCPC. He has taught substance abuse courses as well as other psychology courses. Something else that Anthony is doing, which is amazing, is he has spent his career providing employee assistance counseling and working with organizations and workforces to understand mental health wellness and integrate mental healing among their workforce. He provides a lot of psychoeducation as well as consultation services with organizations such as Under Armour. And he has provided leadership to expand businesses as well as nonprofits, understanding and commitment to mental health, substance use, addictions, including disordered and high-risk gambling, wellness, and clinical services and psychoeducation. He is a sought-after consultant and clinical presenter on mental health and wellness. And so in some, Anthony Parenti has spent the last 36 years, and the reason why we're giving this award, as I stated, because he's helping countless gamblers, affected others, family members, businesses, companies, and communities heal and work through recovery one day at a time. Help to heal from trauma and grief and loss, and to increase public awareness on these mental health challenges. More than anything else, I'm very proud and feel very excited and honored that to give to someone I count as a friend. Anthony is a compassionate and caring human being who dedicates his life and leadership to help every person experience self-love, self-compassion, and hope for the future. So we applaud you, Anthony, for your tireless excellence and leadership in disordered gambling, addiction, and mental health clinical services, consultation, psychoeducation, community wellness, and advocacy. So I'm going to read the award states. The Dr. Joseph W. Shiraki Excellence in Problem Gambling Award is presented to Anthony S. Parenti, MA, LCPC, ICGC2, BACC, for his outstanding leadership, advocacy, clinical treatment, and community wellness on problem gambling and co-occurring mental health concerns on this day, June 17th, 2022. And I will be delivering this to Anthony soon. So turn it over to you, Anthony.
Thank you, Debbie. I am most grateful to Dr. Debbie Haskins, who has been a dear friend, a trusted colleague, and a guiding force to me over the span of many years. As many of you know, I love to talk when I have an audience. But don't worry, I will be brief. I want to thank the Maryland Council on Problem Gambling, and I want to also provide thank you to the Maryland Center of Excellence on Problem Gambling. These two programs do so much to help and improve the lives of so many in our state and are invaluable. I am thrilled and honored to receive this award. Dr. Joe Shiraki was a legend as a teacher, an author, a mentor to many, and a trailblazer in the field of problem gambling. He loved the field of psychology from the start of his studies and was dedicated to relieving the pain and suffering of others. He was the director of addiction services at Taylor Manor Hospital, where he worked with problem gamblers and their families. I shared this with Debbie recently, but my first gambling clients came to me from Dr. Shiraki referring them my way. So he was instrumental in my beginnings of the field of problem gambling and my journey over the last 15 years. It's been an honor to be of service to what he valued and what he worked for. Receiving this award is a highlight in my career. I've been fortunate to be a part of the center since the early years, and I owe so much to the people who have been a part of the center over the years. Joanna Franklin generously gave her support to me. She contributed greatly to my growth. She was a model and inspiration for many who are gathered here today. I want to acknowledge that the center has evolved in her vision, and it's been an honor and privilege to be a part of carrying on her vision of the center. I would like to thank Carl Robinson, who offered me my first opportunity to train professionals in the field of problem gambling and with whom I enjoyed working with immensely. I would also like to express my deep gratitude and affection to my mentor and friend, Dr. Lori Rugel, for whom I have learned so much and have enjoyed working with side by side. Lastly, I'd like to thank each of you for being a part of my professional career over the years and for being here today. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say before you leave, thank you, Dr. Haskins, and congratulations, Anthony, for that very well-deserved award. Really appreciate it. So I am here to present, if I can get my PowerPoint up and share my screen. Here we go. Share. I am here to present the Jeffrey M. Beck Award Road to Recovery Scholarship. This award honors a Maryland clinician who's demonstrated a continuing commitment and passion to integrate counseling, uh, integrate counseling for gambling disorder within mental health and/or substance abuse services, and demonstrates ongoing engagement with the center, displaying a continuing interest in pursuit of problem gambling awareness, prevention, recovery, and treatment. Jeffrey Beck worked tirelessly with the National Council on Problem Gambling, providing valuable insight into industry trends in both treatment and recovery. The 2022 Jeffrey M. Beck Award will honor Jeff's work not only with NCPG, but with us here at the center as a staff person by providing a selected clinician an all expense paid trip, including registration to the National Conference on Problem Gambling Conference in July of 2023. Okay. I am pleased and want to be able to honor. I am pleased to present this award to Dr. Baruch Tedessa, Chief Clinical Director from the, and let me switch my screen so you can see him. He is the Chief Clinical Director from the Family Health Center located in Southern Maryland. He has worked diligently to ensure those suffering with gambling problems and their families receive the services they need. I would like you all to join me in welcoming Dr. Tedessa. Dr. Tedessa, you can come up on the screen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Director. I appreciate the introduction and also the recognition of the type of work we do in our community for many years, and where I realized that even though the clinic I serve or work at focus on addiction, and the gambling is considered as one of the behavior disorder that has affected lots of people without being identified or suffering in their lives, which also recognize most of the time there is underlying psychological and emotional disturbances. And the process was a learning experience. Even though we have experience in other addiction treatment, gambling treatment or addiction of gambling disorder was a unique and a very fascinating aspect of treatment that we have been provided. And when Mr. Will came and introduced himself and the service that the Maryland Center of Excellence in Gambling has been doing this amazing work to serve our community, was very exciting. And I didn't hesitate and joined that movement with him. And ever since, we've been providing this service in our community. And it is very rewarding. And also, I'm sure these services will continue to expand and touch a lot of people to get them to a better life and overcome their challenge. And it's also an honor to be part of this movement and be honored on this special 9th anniversary of the Maryland Center of Excellence in Gambling. And I appreciate that, and I'll share all this distinction with the rest of my staff who've been supportive in this venture.
Yeah, we just want to congratulate you on doing such terrific work and working with us so well to meet the needs of people with gambling addiction.
And we'll continue the work. It seems like an endless journey.
Oh, thank you very much. And we'll move on to our next award.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Heather Eshelman. I'm the prevention manager here at the Maryland Center of Excellence on Problem Gambling. And I'm very excited today to present the 2022 Excellence in Problem Gambling Prevention Award. This is our second annual award, and it's given to either an organization or school that participates in the special population or youth grants provided by the center. And the school or organization integrates problem gambling prevention strategies into their current programming. And I encourage you to go visit our exhibitor hall because most of our grantees are there in the exhibit hall, and you can see a snapshot of some of the good work that they do. So just before we announce the winner, I just want to thank all of our grantees for this year, for FY '22. These are our returning grantees, so they worked with us multiple years. We have Area Health Education Center West, My Life Foundation, the National Center for School Mental Health, the Maryland Association of Prevention Professionals and Advocates, MAPA, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI Maryland, and iLaunch iLand. And then we also had new grantees this year, which is exciting to get to know them and see all the work that they were able to do. So the University of Maryland Extension Service, Family and Consumer Sciences, we worked with both the Eastern Shore and the Central Region, integrating problem gambling prevention into financial wellness courses. We also work with the Huntington City Community Development Corporation in Bowie and the Joy Overflow International Ministries in Baltimore County. And finally, Towson University in Northeastern Maryland. So congratulations to all our grantees this year. And I'm pleased to announce that NAMI Maryland is the recipient of this year's Excellence in Problem Gambling Prevention Award. And we know that persons with mental illness are at greater risk of problem gambling behavior. So it's very important to reach this population with prevention messages. And NAMI Maryland has collaborated with the center for the last 4 years. They were our first grantee. And then they've been integrating problem gambling prevention very well in resources for help into the work that they're currently doing. So they have also successfully transitioned from in-person to virtual programming. So that was amazing. And in fiscal year 2019, so before the pandemic, NAMI did a lot of distributing materials in the community, as well as training their helpline staff. I went in person and how they would answer calls if someone had a gambling problem. And also they presented workshops at their in-person conference, but then hit the pandemic, but NAMI didn't slow down to assist us. They included problem gambling messages in their e-newsletters, reaching over 50,000 Marylanders. And then over the last 2 years, they've been including our information in their warm line emails and also posted on their social media accounts, which have over 5,000 followers, and also presented our flyers at virtual events. So they've really done an outstanding job of also promoting March Problem Gambling Awareness Month. So I am happy today to have Alexis Brown, who is the Deputy Director of NAMI, to accept the Excellence in Prevention Award. So Alexis, congratulations, and thank you for being here today and all your good work.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you all for this very, very prestigious award. NAMI Maryland, we're just thrilled to once more be partnered with the Maryland Center of Excellence on Problem Gambling, and we're so grateful to be honored with this award. As we know, there is an overlap between individuals with mental illness and problem gambling. Gambling is classified as addiction and related disorders. With substance use disorders, 4% of adults with a mental illness also have a gambling problem. 95% of problem gamblers have a psychiatric disorder. With more and more gambling opportunities becoming available in Maryland, it is essential for everyone to recognize the signs and symptoms of gambling problems and how to get help. We are thrilled to work with the center not only to expand outreach and education, to continue to facilitate the conversation and help our community to understand the connection between mental illness and gambling addiction. As part of our continued collaboration, the Maryland Center of Excellence on Problem Gambling has been a major part of our outreach and education efforts. In addition to having an ongoing updated list of peer support specialists, Gamblers Anonymous groups, and Gam-Anon support groups available, NAMI Maryland has included a referral to the center's resources to everyone who contacts us through our warm line. Mental health is more important now than ever. 1 in 5 adults experience a mental illness each year in the US. This year, we have seen an increased demand for mental health support services. NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, is the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization, which operates at the national, state, and local level. What makes us effective is the power of personal experience and how transforming trauma into positive action. Everyone is affected somehow, and having small groups of passionate people who can engage the community and partnerships make things happen. So what does that mean? We are the experts. We have direct experience. The power of personal experience, now personal narrative, to change audiences and to change minds. Having a mental illness happens in one's family or directly to you is traumatic. NAMI transforms trauma into positive action and change. Everyone is affected somehow. It directly hits them. They work in the community with, and or it is affecting our bottom line, businesses and taxes and so on. Small groups can engage and activate large groups of passionate volunteers, and we leverage the networks and affiliations of other many stakeholders and partnerships with caring organizations like yours. NAMI Maryland is the NAMI state organization in Maryland which seeks to improve the quality of life for individuals with mental illness and their families. We are dedicated to providing free education, support, and legislative advocacy for persons with mental illnesses, their families, and the wider community during these difficult times. Again, thank you so much for this award, and take care.
Thank you, Alexis. Congratulations to
Thank
NAMI
you.
Maryland. You all
Thank
are
you.
wonderful.
Thanks.
All right, I'll turn it back over to Mary.
Hello again. I just want to add my congratulations to NAMI Maryland and for Alexis for accepting this award on behalf of NAMI Maryland. Also go back and once again say the Jeffrey Beck Award, Dr. Tedessa, and the Sherachi Award to Anthony Parente. Congratulations to all of these individuals and organizations who have really helped us to get the word out on the issue of problem gambling. So my next responsibility is to introduce you to our afternoon keynote speaker. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Alyssa Wilson. She is an associate professor and department chair of applied behavior analysis programs at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology in Southern California. She received her PhD in rehabilitation with an emphasis in behavior analysis and therapy from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. She is a board certified behavior analyst, doctoral, and a licensed behavioral analyst in the state of Missouri and Nevada. She is a co-author of the Gambling Disorder Treatment Handbook, a guide for mental health professionals, and chapters in the Social Work Desk Reference version 4 on gambling disorders. She is also the co-author of Acceptance and Commitment Therapy for Gambling Disorders, a guide for clinicians. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alyssa Wilson.
Thanks, Mary. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. Pardon me real quickly. I have multiple things going on and a chat with tech. Yes. And I don't know how to chat back without speaking out loud as well as you just heard. So let me go and move to sharing my screen. All right. So again, thank you so much for to the Maryland Council and particularly Mary Drexel for the invitation to speak with y'all today. And big thanks for all of you joining from wherever you find yourself to join us today with this wonderful and amazing conference. It is so humbling to be a part of such a great lineup And I want to give a quick thanks to also to our morning keynote, Victor Ortiz, for sharing your perspective and the important relearning nudge that you established all of us to do to think differently and do better. And big thanks to the recovery panel. The stories that you shared really resonated with me and are parallel to similar stories that I've heard with some of the clients in my own practice and research. And the emphasis on detaching with love that was brought up is a very hard concept to really wrap our heads around. And so I always enjoy hearing people talking about it, because again, it helps nudge us to this place of relearning and really coming at a place of love and acceptance, which is a nice kind of segue into what I am going to be talking about today, which is using acceptance and commitment therapy and other forms of kind of third wave, new age forms of intervention strategies, particularly geared for problem gambling. So to begin, just a quick note on those of you who are in recovery. Some of the content might be sensitive, and so please take care of yourself and do what you need to throughout the presentation. A quick warning, in about 2 slides, I will have some images of various forms of gambling. So please know that that's coming. It goes away though thereafter. And again, please take care of yourself and do what you need to throughout our time today. So as we've been discussing here at the conference, we know that gambling disorder is a pervasive problem that doesn't just affect the individual, but also it affects the community members, family, at the policy level, et cetera. And my goal today is to talk about a little bit under where we think about where is gambling, what does this mean, but then also thinking about how do we approach intervention, how do we approach treatment, and how to think about embedding other forms of evidence-based practices into our clinical toolkit, if you will, so that way we can make sure that those clients that we work with that maybe don't fit the typical quote unquote box that we like them to for certain standardized forms of treatment like cognitive behavior therapy or psychopharm, that we actually like build support networks and support nets so that we can ensure that what we're doing in the room with our clients is meaningful. And so I'm hopeful today that if I do my job correctly anyway, that you walk out of here with a couple of key skills for how to use acceptance and mindfulness-based intervention strategies, but also thinking about case conceptualization and thinking about how do we as clinicians try to arrange our therapy sessions and how we approach therapy in a way to mitigate relapse. As we heard from our recovery panel today, we very much know that relapse is part of the recovery process. But how do we mitigate the harm that might come from various types of relapse for the person sitting in front of us? So that will be the goal. If you have questions or anything throughout the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. And I'm hopeful that we can have a robust Q&A session at the end as well. Okay. So as everybody, I'm sure in this audience is aware, gambling is everywhere. It's no longer just something that we can find in a casino, like a brick and mortar casino. We also now have experiences with forms of gambling in airports, in grocery stores. And it's not just something that, was a typical little machine that you would sit down to and maybe play for a couple of hours or what have you. These things are now like larger than life, right? So I always love these 2 pictures down here at the bottom right and the upper left. Those are real pictures. The bottom right came out of a casino in Nevada, and up in the upper left corner, that is in an airport in Vegas. Probably not surprising to anybody that these machines are like 6 times the size of what a typical slot machine used to be. And that's by design, right? That's not an accident. The casino industry is designing newer heavy tech reliant type of machines to keep people interested in coming back and playing. And we know that this is something that the industry is doing now and has done for quite some time. This down here on the bottom left is a picture, again, in Carson City, Nevada, where in a grocery store you can gamble just like on your way out the door. And as somebody who was born and raised in Nevada, I didn't think anything of that. I thought that was normal. I thought that, you know, you could see a slot machine at the casino, but then also at the bank and at the grocery store. And it wasn't until I moved to Mississippi for a year, and I lived then in Southern Illinois and Carbondale, where I started to realize that no, that's not necessarily quote unquote normal. Although fast forward now into our current space in terms of the online gambling space, sports betting, and this blurring line between video games and gambling, I'm starting to see now that it really is everywhere. It's not just a Nevada problem, it's everywhere. We also know with the legalization and the opening for not only online gambling, but also sports betting, that not only is it everywhere, but it's so much easier for people to contact and to access. I mean, if you have your phone, which interestingly, I do not have my phone on me currently, but if you have your phone, right, you can access it just right there on an app, just a couple of buttons, and now you're on your phone. And this is a major consideration that we all have to think about, because now we take a problem and an addiction like gambling that's already considered a silent addiction because we can't necessarily see it or smell it. And now we put it into our pockets. It's no longer just, well, I have to be online on a computer at a desktop. It's now like on my phone where I can access it all the time. And if you have younger people in your life that are playing video games, or if you're like me and you grew up with like a Game Boy in your hand, so you still play video games now and then, you see the overlap as well. This idea that we're blurring the lines between video gaming and gambling. And so now, even driving on the side of the road, I now am bombarded with gambling billboards where now they're pairing maybe my favorite game of Pac-Man with, hey, go play the lotto or the scratch offs. And maybe, you know, that is something where go, ooh, I like playing that. Maybe I should go do that. This is all something that was happening before the pandemic. And since the pandemic, it has just continued to get worse, and it's exacerbated the problem. Now, I like this image. This was a post in The Atlantic that was posted in November of 2021. And the headline really kind of took me and grabbed me. And we knew that gambling addiction was already on the rise and starting to get more, the prevalence rates were kind of decreasing. We're spending a lot of time watching the prevalence rates, particularly in Maryland. Maryland does a great job of identifying prevalence rates, particularly when they legalize gambling in that state. But what we started to find is that the pandemic has really heightened an issue that was already kind of brewing here in the US particularly, but also in other countries in like Australia and in Europe. And with recent legal advancements for online and internet gambling and sports betting, particularly here in the United States, we started to see this addiction problem start to metastasize and get really kind of overwhelming. I'm sure most of you in here who your primary job is to do clinical intervention, are kind of like some of the colleagues that I've been interacting with. Every person that I've talked to that is 100% clinical caseload has ridiculous amounts of wait lists because they just cannot keep up with the demand, both in terms of the need for mental health, kind of globally defined in terms of like depression and anxiety, but also then for gambling addiction and other polysubstance use addictions. And so this is something that we need to kind of keep in mind as we're thinking about ways to not only treat the individual in front of us, but knowing that this is a larger problem. Again, to Victor's point earlier this morning, this is a public health problem. This isn't just an individual problem. And so when we kind of contextualize this in a way, at least from a therapy perspective, we're going to think about this in terms of the many fringes. I like to call this the fringes of therapy, because it's really kind of across the gamut in terms of your training, how much exposure you would be getting to various forms of therapy. But you can see here, I've just kind of identified some of the kind of top contenders, if you will, right? So pharmacotherapy, motivational interviewing, person-centered behavioral approaches. Surprisingly, I was, again, grew up, if you will, in my graduate training to a very behavioral based training. And so I was trained that psychodynamic approaches weren't really used anymore. That is completely false, particularly ever since I moved to California. There's lots of folks using psychodynamic approaches. But when we look in the literature, we see a lot of emphasis on cognitive behavior therapies, motivational interviewing, and there's really this heavy focus on cognitive behavior therapy, brief solution focused, motivational interviewing, stages of change, maybe even, and it's really kind of emphasizing that piece. And what I'm going to talk to us about today, and what I'm going to kind of push us into today is thinking about which therapeutic component fits for the person sitting in front of us, rather than kind of a copy paste approach to how we think about therapy. And in this way, I'm going to argue that we can provide functional or function-based interventions that are then going to help secure our intervention strategy so we can catch folks before they fall through the cracks, if you will. Now, we know from the literature that there are common barriers that preclude or limit the extent to which people are successful when they complete treatment. And this again is a myopic view because it's coming out of research perspectives, right? So you may have a different clinical experience. You might have something that's like not up here on this list, but these are kind of 4 general spaces where researchers have continued to say these are the limitations and the barriers that we see to successful treatment outcomes. The first one is disinhibition. And here we're talking about any type of impulsivity, increased sensation seeking, risk taking. And this is identified as a significant predictor of treatment failure. And this isn't just a one-off. This has been repeated in different labs, in different spaces in multiple countries as well. So if you're more likely to have high risk taking and sensation seeking types of repertoires, you're going to have a harder time in therapy, generally speaking. Now, we also know that individuals with gambling problems also come into therapy with cognitive distortions. And there's been some interesting work done on cognitive distortions that show that the more intense of a belief system we have around those cognitive distortions. So things like the gambler's fallacy, this idea, I hear lots of clients that I work with saying, well, this machine is hot, I know it's going to win, so I'm just going to keep sitting here until it does win. But we know that those machines don't work under that type of reinforcement schedule. They don't necessarily align with some of those distortions that we may carry. And we found in the literature that the more rigid those cognitive distortions are, the harder or the more likely it is that individuals will struggle to stay abstinent following treatment. There's also indications of co-occurring mental health disorders, particularly mood disturbances, high rates of negative affect, personality disorders, et cetera. This is also kind of aligned with some of the things we heard this morning. And what I'm going to add to this is that we also see barriers to successful treatment outcomes due to a lack of functional treatment. And what I mean by that is that we as clinicians provide treatment that we think is going to be tailored to the individual, but when in fact doesn't really get to the underlying reasons for why that person is gambling or using drugs or whatever it is that we're treating or targeting during our treatment. And when we do that, what we ended up doing inadvertently is that we mismatch a replacement behavior or a replacement type of life situation or repertoire, if you will, of the individual. And we align that with this extended period of what I'm going to call extinction. What that means is like minimal forms of reinforcement. We really don't find any value in things that we're doing. We're just kind of saying, hey, you need to stay clean. So just stay clean, maybe go to a GA meeting, talk to some friends, but you can do it. You know, here's how we can help you. And what happens if we don't identify the why behind somebody is gambling, I'm going to argue that we're more likely to set up mismatch replacement behaviors that are then unlikely to be used by that individual when they get to that place of, I have this craving and this urge to go use, and I don't really have the tool set to address it in a functional way. So here's why this is important. There's many different ways to think about why a person gambles. And if you haven't heard of the Pathways model, part of your homework after today's event should be to Google Leah Nauer and Alex Blazinski's Pathways model. That is one way to think about how a person comes to develop a gambling problem. It is a great model. This that I'm going to talk about today is slightly different. So how I'm going to approach why a person gambles isn't necessarily the same way as a Pathways model where we're thinking about, are you behaviorally conditioned? Are you a behavioral condition plus antisocial personality disorder? Like, we're not going to talk about those higher arching histrionic type of perspectives. And instead, I'm going to focus on in the moment, when you feel the urge to go gamble, what is happening? What is the environment like? What are you feeling? What's around you? What is happening right there in that moment of time to figure out why you're gambling? So my colleagues and I did this both for my dissertation and then we continued it afterwards, where we actually looked at figuring out why an individual gambles in the moment. And so then we created a 20 question survey. We subjected it to factorial analyses. We kind of combined it down to 10 questions. I think this particular sample, we subjected it to 400 or 500 people. And what we found was that regardless of how we sliced the data, there were two things that kind of spoke to us. One, the more severe a person's proclivity was to gamble. So we used the SOGS, the South Oaks Gambling Screen, which I know is dated now, but back in 2015, it wasn't. And we use that score to kind of think about one's proclivity to gamble. How much of a gambling problem did they have? And on both models, as you can see here on the right-hand side of the screen, when we subjected that to their total score on the gambling functional assessment, we saw that they had a positive correlation, meaning you had higher total scores on the GFA, the more likely you had a severe gambling problem. The other finding that we keep finding, or we keep getting in our results, is that escape category tends to have higher scores with individuals with higher gambling proclivity scores. And this holds when we look at the PGSI or the SOGS, or if we just kind of use a DSM-5 criteria. We know that the higher the proclivity to gambling, we see this higher score in escape, which suggests to us that individuals who gamble may do so as a way to escape or avoid punitive environments, something aversive, something unpleasant, something they don't really want or like. And as you heard this morning in the recovery panel, we kind of heard nodes of that as well, right? This idea of I can get out of my current life situation through gambling in some aspect, okay? Now, this leads me to then why this is important, right? When we think about why treatment doesn't work, when we think about why it is that people gamble in the moment, what we find in some of my work that I've done is repeatedly this notion of escape maintain behavior or experiential avoidance. And so we're going to think about experiential avoidance as the attempt to regulate events, even when attempts to do so cause significant behavioral harm. Okay, so here it is again, if we just hang out here, we know that the attempts to regulate events that we maybe cannot control. So I'm going to say like things like my thoughts, my feelings, how my spouse interacts with me, how my kids interact with me, how my neighbor interacts with me, my boss, etc. Right? All those things that I cannot really control, when I attempt to control them, even when doing so causes significant behavioral harm. When we do those things, we start to strengthen this muscle of experiential avoidance. And that muscle is strengthened not just with problem gamblers. That is a strengthened muscle across human suffering. That is something that we see regardless of diagnostic criteria, regardless of presenting symptomology. I see this even in, young graduate students that I work with that come in, they're like, I am ready to fix the world. And you're like, yep, but have you looked at yourself? Because we all struggle with some aspect and we engage in some aspect of experiential avoidance. And if you don't agree with me, hang out and let's see if when we talk about today, if you can start to see this in your own space. So my tech folks, this is poll 1. If you can launch it.
Yep, it takes a second.
Okay. Sure. There you go. All right, so the first poll question, I want to kind of get a sense of what you think experiential avoidance is. Is it running, fighting, hiding, or any attempt to escape or avoid something? Is it acceptance? Is it something that is bad? I see all of you are paying attention. We're seeing lots of answers. I know that I'm only seeing them now. So we got 94%. There we go. I'll share them with you. Right. So you all identified the right one, right? Running, fighting, hiding, any attempt to escape. All right. So when we think about running, fighting, and hiding, right, these are all going to be that repertoire, that muscle that we engage in when we experience something that is unwanted, painful. In this little diagram here, it's represented by this like yellow lightning bolt, right? And so you can see here that whatever running away looks like, right, may be different. Not only across people, but can also be different within the person. So my running, fighting, and hiding may be different depending on if I'm at work, if I'm dealing with a family situation, if I'm dealing with like a childhood trauma, right? It could all look different. And so it's important to recognize that some of those treatment modalities I talked about earlier, can target experiential avoidance, but their approaches to do so have been shown limiting to date. And I'm going to kind of talk about that more in a bit. I will also add, though, that experiential avoidance it can also look like something more than just running, fighting, and hiding, but we can also think about this as like literally stepping over the problem and trying to like work ourselves around the issue. And it can also be this idea of like burying our heads in the sand, right? This idea of like, well, if I don't see it and I don't talk about it, then it doesn't exist. And I don't even have to recognize it as a problem. And I will also say too, that there are some forms of experiential avoidance repertoires and patterns of behavior that are actually pretty adaptive and healthy. I have found myself working in work environments that are kind of toxic, and like burying your head in the sand is actually a pretty healthy way to kind of work through a toxic work environment. Now, is it good for the long term? No, probably not. But in that moment, maybe that helps me to, not, yell back at my boss or do something I might regret later. So it's not to say that all experiential avoidance repertoires are somehow bad or we need to target and change them, as much as it is to say that these might be the reasons under which people or the person in front of us in our therapeutic context are using and engaging in gambling or other drug use. And this is why this is important. And while you can target experiential avoidance in cognitive behavior therapy, psychopharmacology, other forms of therapies, most of the time, what we've found in CBT is there is what I would call a relatively large percentage of individuals who aren't successful with abstaining or staying abstinent following treatment. Depending on where you're looking and depending on what study, sometimes that percentage of what they would call treatment failure individuals are anywhere from like 20 to as high as 38 to 39% of the population in that study, which can equal 10 to 50 people, depending on how big of a study that is. And I'm going to argue that if our treatment failure rate is 10% or higher, then maybe we need to kind of reconfigure and think differently, or at least more critically, about what we're doing in a therapeutic context. So that way we can start to think about, process-focused therapies rather than just a copy-paste approach. And so emerging alternative approaches, particularly what has been called third wave process-based approaches, typically including forms of acceptance and mindfulness-based approaches, they've emerged as a promising treatment option, particularly for these types of experiential avoidance repertoires. And it's important to note that these third wave treatment approaches incorporate biological, psychological, and sociocultural, spiritual components to treat not just the presenting problem, but also that underlying problem that people typically disclose when they're coming to treatment. And so it's not to say that CBT is not a third wave intervention per se, but it is to push ourselves into this idea and this space of how do we get to acceptance and mindfulness-based process interventions, again, rather than a cookie cutter modeling, here's what I learned how to do at some workshops, so now I'm going to do it here. And so one of the things that we did, my research team and I did, this paper was published in the Research and Social Work Practice in 2015. We looked at the effects of mindfulness-based interventions on gambling behavior and symptoms. And we targeted 3 gambling-specific behaviors and symptoms: the gambling itself, urges to gamble, and financial outcomes, or any kind of financial interventions. And so we we reviewed over 3,000 titles and abstracts from our search, conducting a meta-analysis, and we retained any studies that had any kind of randomized control trial, single subject design. They had to have some type of control aspect to it. And we kind of looked to see anything that's out there, but then we only subjected studies that had the randomized control trial designs in them. We looked at participants that had to be identified by the author as having some level of problematic or disordered gambling. We included all types of settings and geographical contexts. We specifically targeted interventions that looked at mindfulness-based interventions, such as methods for teaching mindful awareness, any kind of like meditative interventions. Mindfulness interventions were also targeting any kind of like present moment work, relaxation training, breathing techniques, and awareness to overall moment and in vivo kind of practices, or informal, even like homework style meditation practices. And again, the time period here was any article published between 1980 and 2014. And through all of that, we ended up with 13 studies included in the review and 7 RCT. So when we take a look at gambling behavior specifically, we find that all the articles included, all of the 7 articles, found that the mindfulness group favored outcomes from the control. Either that was a waitlist control or treatment control. So here we see that our K values were favored treatment. You can see that by the large, if I just move this around, you can see that here by the large diamond for the grand mean, it favors treatment. All right. The next outcome we looked at was gambling urges, same finding here. Results favored the mindfulness interventions over control for reduced gambling urges. And interestingly, for the financial interventions, we only found 3 articles targeting finances in any capacity, and of which, so still, if they did targeted finance, we found that the results favored the mindfulness interventions over the control piece. So I look at this and say, well, there's something happening here with this mindfulness piece that is improving gambling-related symptoms. But that we also need to have way more research that actually targets finances. I think 3 of 7 is okay, but it would be nice the next time we do this or somebody else replicates this, that we have more like 7 of 7 or 10 of 10 that include finances. All right, so that's kind of the overview of like this mindfulness piece. And again, we'll talk about a little bit more about like what that means and what that looks like. But when we then combine that with this acceptance piece and this process-centered piece, we start to kind of explore out into, again, third wave interventions, acceptance and commitment treatment or acceptance and commitment therapy. We also there's been some play with dialectical behavior therapy, functional analytic psychotherapy, but I'm going to talk about acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT for short, today. And this is not something that I want you all to believe just because I'm up here presenting it. There are countless now meta-analyses that continue to show the benefits of ACT, not just for substance use disorders or gambling, but a range of symptoms and problems. I like to tell students when I'm teaching them on how to do this type of intervention, I usually tell them, go out and find a population where ACT doesn't work, because so far we have not found any population. Every time anybody has done like any kind of review on ACT, it always is more favorable to treatment control or other forms of current active treatment. So when it comes to gambling, I'm just going to highlight one of the studies that I did with my colleagues where we looked at, or we wanted to know if there was any kind of neurological evidence of ACT in college age gamblers. So we subjected 18 disordered gamblers who were under the age of 21 to a randomized control trial where they were either presented with a waitlist control where they waited 8 weeks before they received ACT treatment, or they went right into immediate exposure to ACT. We looked at the fMRI bold images. So we subjected them to an MRI machine where we had them gamble. Well, they played on a computerized slot machine. I say gamble, but we simulated gambling. There was no money, there was no wagering, but we did have them win their jackpot money so that we could produce similar types of neurological outcomes that we would see if they were out in the world gambling. We also then subjected them or asked them to rate each outcome and how close each outcome was to a win when they were in. And here's the exercises we did. And I just want to kind of highlight real quickly that if we just kind of look over here on the left-hand side, if we just looked at how they rated the outcomes from how close they were to a win between treatment and control, we really see no differences across pre and post. But when we come over here to their brain data, what we found was that before we subjected anybody to waitlist or treatment, all of the individuals had high rates of dopaminergic activation during wins when we kind of subtracted wins from loss outcomes, which has been shown across various research teams, different types of gamblers. We know that the dopaminergic activation is there when in the presence of a win. What was interesting is when these folks came back after the 8 weeks of treatment, we saw differences between treatment and control groups. The treatment individuals now, instead of having dopaminergic activation, their brain activities were more in the midbrain to prefrontal cortex, which my neuropsychologist colleague tells me is means a whole bunch of stuff that they're thinking, and now they're kind of recalling things. They're not just kind of sitting back getting that dopamine high. And there's a variety of different theories that we can put around this. My point here is to highlight that our brains can change, and we can change how our brains function through psychotherapy. And ACT is just another way to show us that yes, we can do that. All right, so what is ACT? Well, essentially, ACT is the idea that we are going to relate relational networks in ways that are nuanced and set up like metaphors and paradoxes in order for the person in front of us to establish their own rules about the world rather than us telling them about the world. And we're going to do that by making sure that we help kind of those cognitive distortions. We help folks understand the difference between cognitive distortions and real things. They're real because we're experiencing them, but they don't necessarily have to impact what we do. And I'm really breaking this down really quickly, but I like this idea of this save the trees metaphor. And I feel like this is a great metaphor for ACT, right? Save the trees. It's printed on cardstock, and yet the call is to save the trees. You just killed a bunch of trees to pitch the idea of saving the trees. ACT kind of comes at that as well. It's going to have this idea that we're going to use metaphor, paradox, experiential learning exercises to help clients contact various private events, physiological sensations, things that they've been trying to avoid in the past, to actively participate in engaging in new repertoires, new behavior, practice the muscle that is not experiential avoidance. And so we're going to do this by taking a major shift in our treatment focus. We're going to shift away from this idea that we have to feel good, and we're going to move into feeling good. I put extra emphasis on the feeling or the goodness, because in an ACT perspective, it no longer matters if we feel good or bad or happy or melancholic. None of that matters. We have a feeling. I feel as though I'm talking too much and I'm not going to run out of time. Great, that's a feeling. I can have that feeling, I can be in that space, and I can choose to engage in a behavior that gets me closer to what I want my life to be about. Sounds really easy to talk about. It's a different muscle to practice, which is why we have to practice it in session. So this is the shift. We're going to shift away from focusing on feeling good to feeling good. Okay. Now, this is the general question that most ACT interventionists will tell you that they come to in each session. So essentially, I'm going to ask it to you. I want you all to show up to this question in your own unique way. In this moment, are you, not the stories you tell about yourself, but you, willing to show up to whatever you are experiencing without defense? See things for what they are, not what they say they are. Freely choose a direction you want to head in, and gently return to that direction when you find yourself off track. If the answer to that question is yes, we are going to call that in this model psychological flexibility. You have flexibility in terms of how you're showing up to the moment, showing up to all the things, the thoughts, the feelings, the external event stuff, situations that's happening, and you are freely choosing to head in a direction you want to head in. If the answer to that is no, we're going to call that psychological inflexibility. We're relying on one or two or single repertoires or responses rather than really kind of embedding the flexibility to freely kind of choose how to move forward, taking all of those thoughts and feelings and environmental events with us on our trek. Okay. Now, this model here that's presented on the screen is called the hexaflex. This is what's typically used in ACT sessions, this idea of a hexaflex. There's 6 components, but I have been playing around with kind of condensing these components. And so today I'm going to talk to you about a newer model, or how I've conceptualized this model, whereas we're focusing on acceptance, flexible perspective taking, So the I here now can understand that the you there then is somehow different, yet also experiencing the same here now in this space. If your brain hurts, that's okay. We do this all the time. Think about like the GRE test or some of those things that you learned in high school, those logic statements, right? That's that perspective taking. I here now, you there then. And then we're also going to focus on values-based action. And all of those things are housed or controlled or supported by present moment awareness. Okay. The idea here is that we cannot accept, we cannot engage in flexible perspective taking. I can't get closer to the life that I want, that I value, without connecting with the present moment. So here the idea is that the action is on experiencing all aspects of the here and the now, the things I like, the things I don't like, the thoughts that I have, the urges that I have. Rather than trying to fight them or push them away or change them, we're going to allow them to be as they are, as a way to kind of get out of our minds and into our life, is usually the metaphorical phrase used. And by that, we mean that we're going to attend to all the stimuli, not just the ones that we want or the ones that are really aversive or painful. And we're going to do that as an alternative to living in some imagined future or some reimagined past. And we're going to try to then center ourselves in the here and the now. And there's many ways to do that, ranging from like, you know, purely kind of meditative processes all the way to kind of body scans, relaxation tools. What I like to tell clinicians, though, if you're exploring present moment exercises for yourself, the next time your phone rings and you're not on call and like you're not expecting some big phone call, just notice what it's like to hear your phone ring and not pick it up. Notice the urges to pick it up. Notice all the thoughts that you experience. Then what happens when it stops ringing and you either hear a ding like, ooh, they left a message, or maybe potentially worse, you never hear a ding because they didn't leave a message. So now notice all the difference in your thoughts and the feelings about, I got to check it. Who is it? Why didn't they leave a message? Okay, go on and on. It's very helpful to understand how people experience the world when they say, I'm not going to gamble anymore. I'm not going to have a drink. And now all of a sudden they experience those urges, those cravings, those thoughts, and you can't just say, turn it off. And I'm going to kind of experience that more with you all later as we move forward. Another common present moment exercise is mindful eating, mindful drinking. This is also very helpful and relaxing to really just kind of notice each step in the process when you eat something, when you have a cup of coffee, notice what it's like before it gets into your mouth, notice what it's like once you swallow it, notice what it's like for the next thought or urge to then drink or eat again. Again, the idea here is to practice staying in the moment, noticing when you're get stuck and pulled back into your thoughts or your feelings and kind of coming back then into the world around us. Now, for values-based action, the goal here is that our life gets put on hold while we try to control our suffering. And so instead, we're going to counter that by behaving in ways that lead us to a life that we want, a meaningful life, something that we want that we're not currently contacting. So values can be considered ongoing, dynamic, and evolving patterns of freely chosen behavior. Okay? Typically, they change. Typically, they're not something that is static. They're dynamic. They can change. And it's oftentimes coming back to this heart of commitment. How do you know you're committed to engaging in a new behavior? Because doing so is aligning with some level of a value. You want your life to be a certain way. How do you know that? Because my behavior is going to align in a certain way. Now, this doesn't mean that if somebody relapses, they no longer value sobriety. That doesn't mean that. It means instead that we got stuck looking somewhere else. We got stuck in the thoughts or the feelings or kind of wanting to escape or avoid something unpleasant. Not that, sobriety isn't a value. We stumble. We're human. It happens. The point here is to remember that, we are never too far south to turn around and head north. Okay? Values are always something that we can commit to and turn and change our behavior to start heading back towards those valued directions. Now, here's an example of something we published in the Act for Gambling book. We had them go through 10 valued domains. We then had them identify 3 that they weren't really, living consistently with. Here is one of those examples. You don't really need to read the chicken scratch as much as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, the mapping of your values. You can see that for this participant, they valued the family relations that they were hard to actually live consistently with because it took so long for that person to travel there. They had to go through a bunch of mountains and they had to get on a train and a bus and all this kind of stuff. So it was hard to actually live consistently with that value. If you see here on the bottom right of the screen, it says value is health. And we got the Alice in Wonderland bunny with the time piece, right? Because he valued health, but he didn't have enough time to get there. And how this process can help us understand what's going on with our clients is we can understand what they value and what they find meaning in their life and how they report how they struggle to get there. Some of those barriers are real things. Like if your family lives in another country and it takes you 30 hours to get there and thousands of dollars, that's a real barrier. But if it's something like I don't have enough time, and we know that that's kind of a constructed view of the future, then maybe we can start to help our client rethink or kind of dismantle this notion that they don't have time for something that they find value in. Okay. Now, when we move to acceptance, here we're going to target experiential avoidance through this ongoing practice in a safe and secure environment on how to actually contact something that's aversive or painful or unwanted in a way that then activates and engages in new repertoires or a new muscle. So the idea here is that humans engage in escape and avoidance types of behaviors as a typical way that humans behave. It's integrated into our notion of human suffering. And the problem here, though, is that when you're not willing to have something, you have it. And I'm going to highlight this in a couple of slides to get to this point that when we say, I'm not going to think about how much I really want that second cup of coffee or that cigarette or to go gamble, that doesn't help us stop having those urges to have those things. So on the flip side of that, then we're going to help our clients to contact the willingness to experience unwanted thoughts and urges in a way that's not an act of surrender. Nobody is saying that you are always going to be a gambler, so just surrender to it. No. That is not acceptance. Rather, it is giving ourselves permission to feel what we are feeling, to think what we are thinking, and actively choose our behavior. Okay. Now, the more mainstream forms of psychology discuss willingness as something that is kind of this lofty kind of concept. But for me, I think about willingness as a way to kind of understand what is being avoided, how is it being avoided, to then help us get to willingness. Well, what is important here? If this thing is important, how willing are you to experience this level of distress? And I can guarantee you it starts really small. It starts really small. I give clients the Likert scale. How willing are you? They're like, absolutely not. And after a couple of sessions, maybe now they're like, okay, I'm at a 1 or a 2. But I don't want it. I don't like it. Nobody asked you to like it. But are you willing to experience it if it means we can start practicing this new muscle? So this idea of willingness, right? Being open to one's whole experience, while also actively and intentionally choosing to move in a valued direction. Developing willingness through a process of contacting the present moment as it is, not as we say it is or as we want it to be, but as it is, with whatever internal experiences are present, while simultaneously taking action to guide us to our valued life. And that is tricky. Oftentimes people think that I'm talking about willingness to experience distress, to white knuckle it. If I just grin and bear it, I can ride the wave and I'll be done. I am not trying to ask you to all be the guy building the sandcastle in front of the tsunami wave. That is not going to work. Okay? But maybe we can learn to surf, or maybe we can learn to get ready for the wave. Maybe there are other ways that we can experience willingness that's not necessarily trying to hide it, fix it, or run from it. Okay. Another way to think about willingness, like this picture on the right-hand side here, is instead of engaging in the tug of rope or tug of war, or in that game when you were kids, maybe we just let go of the rope. And we're like, I'm good. I don't need to play this anymore. Again, sometimes easier said than done, but that is the goal. Now, when we get to then taking a flexible perspective taking approach to the world as we are experiencing it, we're talking about targeting experiential avoidance through approaching and activating new muscles and integrating aspects of experiential willingness, present moment focus, and the acceptance of how we want to get closer to a life that we value. So the goal here is to help our clients with flexible rules rather than rules that society gave us, rules that they feel like they should be having, or rules that our therapist gives us. Sometimes those can be very helpful, but sometimes those rules don't always align with what the environment is producing or how they experience the environment. So it's really helpful to have the client develop their own rules. And I'm not going to go into detail, but we do have some research that shows that we can give people rules and they'll follow it even if the environment changes. So it's really important that we equip our clients with rules that can change when the environment changes. And there's very just different forms of how to target this through exercises like diffusion or Titchener's deliteralization exercise, where we can repeat words until they take on sounds again, rather than like the meaning of the word. And there's also different ways that we can think about taking various perspectives, particularly through transcendental senses of self, or the idea that the you who's here now listening to me, you can also kind of meditate and kind of watch the you who's having the thoughts, who's watching me do the talk. It can get very heady as you kind of go up the transcendental self stage. The goal, though, is just to help clients see things for what they are, right? If our client feels like they are in jail because of all of these bad thoughts that are around them, how can we help them see their world through their dog's perspective, as the dog sees that it's like a invisible jail? Now, this all comes down to this idea with control, right? Maybe you've already contacted this. Maybe you're already sitting there going, wait a second. How can I control this? I can't control these things. I can't control this thing. What do you mean I'm supposed to just like accept the world? Well, let's hang out in this space for a little bit, okay? Remember, I was telling you earlier, the problem isn't trying to accept something. The problem is with this idea of trying to control it. So if you are willing, wherever you are, for the next 30 seconds or until I tell you to stop, which will probably be before 30 seconds, whatever you do, don't think about chocolate cake. Ready? Go. Don't do it. Don't think about chocolate cake. Don't do it. Don't think about chocolate cake. Don't do it. Don't think about chocolate cake. Okay. Now, think to yourself about how many times you thought about chocolate cake. Even those of you who are like, I never did it, you at least had to think about it once, because you had to think to yourself what not to think first. It's like inherent in the rule. Now, think about whatever you want for the next 30 seconds or until I tell you to stop. Ready, go. Think about whatever you want. Think about whatever you want. All right, go ahead and stop. Now, maybe some of you thought about chocolate cake. Maybe some of you didn't. Now, here's the rub. For the next 30 seconds or until I tell you to stop, whatever you do, don't raise your hand. Go. Don't do it. Don't raise your hand. Don't do it. Don't raise your hand. All right, now stop. Now, maybe you noticed a few things there. My thought is that the majority of you didn't raise your hand. And if you did, that's because you have a different type of function. I have done this before in groups with different people, and there's always one in a room that wants to raise their hand when you say don't raise your hand, which is a perfect example. But what you can see here is that when I tell you what not to think, you struggle. There's struggle in it. Even if you like went all the way on the other side and started thinking about zoo animals or what you're going to do with your spouse later tonight or how you're going to avoid the storm, you still started from what not to think about. Therefore, everything that was produced after that was as a result of that word, don't do it. It's inherent in the rule. You might not be able to control the things that you think and feel, but my money would be on that you didn't raise your hand. Maybe it's not about what we are thinking or feeling that we're trying to control. Maybe it's about what we do. Maybe it's about controlling our actions as a step towards living a valued life and what we want to actually do in our life. So as I take the remaining time, I want to just show you some case data where we exposed 3 participants who self-referred to treatment. They all had high proclivity to gamble. We also gave them the GFA that I showed you earlier. We gave them the GSAS to kind of get a sense for like their gambling preferences. And again, they all had between 11 to a score of 18 on the SOGS. For context, the SOGS score is out of 20. So they had some pretty significant gambling at intake. And they also then provided a goal for if they wanted to gamble responsibly or if they wanted to abstain from gambling. Now we can have a whole nother kind of conversation around whether or not we should be promoting responsible use or harm reduction strategies in treatment. But for right now, we're just going to know that Mary and Sue both wanted to learn how to gamble responsibly, and Paul wanted to abstain from gambling. Their names have also been changed for confidentiality. So here are Mary's results. So on the top part of the panel, you see Mary's self-report on the Likert scale. She was given a 1 to 7 Likert scale for how close she was to never gambling again, how close she was, how believable her thoughts were to gamble, how close she was to living to her values, etc. What you can see at the top is about after the 3rd session, we start to see a nice clear separation between data paths, wherein she's starting to rate her thoughts less believable over time, and starting to rate her valued living scores higher over time. Down at the bottom panel, you can see gambling frequency is denoted on the primary y-axis with the yellow path, and the gambling duration, which is represented in the secondary y-axis in the blue bars. Gambling duration is scaled here from 1, 2, 3, and 4, 4 being over 6 hours for that particular day or week, and then 1 is less than 30 minutes. So what you can see here with Mary is she came in at intake, she reported gambling over 6 hours for at least 6 days during the past week. Immediately we see decreased reports in terms of number of days and duration of play. We do see it start to increase on the last day. She did go 2 days, but she kept the total duration down. So typically I'll say something kitschy here, like, do you think that she still had a gambling problem? Should we send her back out into the world? Obviously, this was just an 8-week kind of demonstration. She wasn't done. We actually referred her to further treatment afterwards, just to kind of keep, continuity of treatment services. Now here's Sue. Remember, Sue also selected to gamble responsibly. You can see her Likert scale responses on the top panel, where we didn't really get that same type of differentiation of data paths over time. In fact, you start to see a cyclical cycle, right? Where about every 3 to 4 weeks, we saw increases in her believability of thoughts. Those also corresponded to showing up to treatment with higher rates of anxiety that week, higher rates of, I have to succumb to my gambling problem, etc. When we look at her gambling data, you can see that while she wanted to decrease her gambling, she decreased in terms of number of days, but their total duration stayed constant, right? So she continued to gamble for 6 hours or more through all 7 sessions of treatment, even though she was going for less days, which technically fit her treatment goal of gambling responsibly. But from a provider perspective, I look at this and I go, this is not getting better. This is getting worse because you're going for fewer days and longer over time. These are the types of things that we need to start to think about when we start to say, when we push for harm reduction strategies. We have to be able to look at the nuances of what that means and how much harm is really being exposed to when we're saying shorter amount of days, but the same amount of duration. All right, and here is Paul's data. So what you can see here at the top, it took him longer than Mary before we started to see differentiation in his Likert scale responding, but we did over time. Again, you start to see that he's reporting believing in his thoughts less and increasing to close to his like living, connecting with his values. Which again, we would expect given the ACT intervention strategy. And when we look at then his gambling behavior in the bottom panel, we see that he showed up at intake gambling for about 4 days over the total of 6 hours to an immediate decrease and eventual abstinence starting at week 4. Again, Paul didn't end treatment there. We also then referred him out to treatment or to another treatment provider after this was completed. Again, just for continuity of services. I will also say too that there was lots of, when he showed up at week 3, he explained it as like a relapse. He's relapsed because he kind of thought about that 1 week without gambling as like abstaining. And it was helpful to kind of put in and conceptualize that for him in terms of how that doesn't necessarily mean you're using again. You used that time period, but now let's again turn it around. You can start sober today, and that was exactly how we proceeded. Now, all of this kind of shows you a new way to, or a different way to think about how to embed acceptance and mindfulness-based interventions, particularly for individuals with gambling disorders. And I've shown you just a glimpse into some of the research that we've been doing on gambling specifically, not just thinking about how to provide treatment interventions, but also how to think about why a person gambles in the moment, in addition to how they develop a problem with gambling. And one of the things that I have been focusing on is this interplay between, translational and clinical research, particularly as it pertains to some of the concepts that have been under-researched. And I hope that you got this sense in the talk. And I want to kind of just stress that researchers can't live without clinical practitioners, and clinical practitioners can't live without researchers. And I think that we need to build bridges together to make sure that the questions we're answering as researchers are aligning with the needs in clinical practice, and that the research that we are doing is meaningful and we can kind of put it into action. I think the research I've shown today kind of shows that as a way to kind of help you to think about how you can not only collect data during your own clinical practice, but also then thinking about how you can embed new intervention strategies with that. And I will just end by saying thank you so much for your time today. I think we have maybe a time for a question or two. If not, you can contact me. There's my email. If you are going to NCPG this year, please come and say hello. I am doing a workshop with my fabulous colleagues, Dr. Malkin, Judge Cheryl Moss, my co-author, Jody Bechtold, on gambling motivated crime. So please come and say hello. If not, thank you so much for listening.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
Dr. Wilson, there is
Yes.
time. This is Mary.
Okay.
There is time for some questions. We have about 10, 12
Oh, good.
minutes. There are some questions in the question and answer. First one being, just because, this is from a Mr. Block, just because relapse among disordered gamblers is common, it does not follow that relapse is part of the recovery process. Please comment on why you think that relapse is part of that process.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. So in my experience, the folks that I have worked with, both on a personal, and as a professional experience, relapse has been a part of their experience. I understand that that is not everybody's experience, but I also like to help get people to this understanding that relapse doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. There's not something, you're not like a weak-willed person. And so when I normalize it, it kind of helps people to come back to treatment sooner. Now, I think that's couched by also saying that there are ways, and researchers are thinking about ways to mitigate relapse, and how can we establish environments that support continued abstinence. But I agree with your comment that it may not be part of everybody's process, but it is a part of some.
Okay. Another question is, have you found or do you see gambling to be a greater problem in teens because of easy access?
Yes. Yes. I would just send the group to Jeff Deravinsky's work. He does a lot of amazing work with teens and adolescents, and some of the stuff that I've just seen that he's produced also says the same thing. Like accessibility is a big reason for why we're seeing increased numbers, particularly in younger adults.
Okay, another question, Hang. Is ACT a form of treatment that primarily targets individuals that struggle with managing feelings of anger as opposed to anxiety, depression, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, actually, there's been some amazing meta-analyses conducted that shows that ACT is a very effective intervention for depression and anxiety, particularly. I believe the VA has also established ACT as a evidence-informed practice that they can use for depression in the VA, or if it's not approved yet, it's like in the works. No, like I said earlier, I get my students and people I work with to say, go find a population where it doesn't work with, because I haven't seen it. And we've actually started to, in the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, which is the organization for ACT and all things related to ACT. People have even started to like purposely go out and see if it doesn't work with really severe cases or forms of like, severe mental illness. And there are some spaces in the severe mental illness world where DBT is more of an effective approach because of variations of how they present DBT and the insular services that are provided in a real DBT model. But for the most part, no, I would say that ACT is and can be useful.
Okay, another question. Does accepting your own imperfections fit into ACT?
For sure. For sure. Yes. I think that, it's important to remember that we as clinicians are humans too. And like, if we can acknowledge that we also have our own suffering and our own struggles and apply some of these things that we're using with our clients on ourselves, it can help us to understand like what works for us and maybe why. And so that way we can kind of adapt for our clients. One of the things that I didn't really mention that I think is useful to mention now is that, metaphors, for example, not all metaphors stick, right? Like I can use a metaphor that is really impactful on one client, but I can turn and use the same one with another one. And they're like, what are you talking about? And so that, when we're thinking about why does ACT not work, or I did it, but it was messy, or they didn't really get it. Sometimes it's just because we haven't really identified stimulus functions for why that metaphor would have worked or why it doesn't work. And so sometimes it's just about figuring out a way to relate to your client to get them to kind of contact those things in a new way.
Okay, a question from Kevin is, how do you help a person determine whether their value is truly something they believe in, as opposed to what they feel others expect for them or feel they may garnish admiration for that value?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say this, I'll answer it in two ways. One, I always approach values like how I think Carl Rogers would approach it. And what I mean by that is unconditional positive regard. If somebody tells me they value, being a rich person with a bunch of houses and cars, I'm not going to question that per se, as much as I might say things like, great, why is that? Tell me about that. So I can get to the underlyingness of like, well, I want people to think that I'm important. I want people to feel like they can rely on me. And we can start to kind of build the fabric out of why that is of value. rather than saying, well, I don't think you value that per se. And understanding too that values change. And sometimes we can value two things that conflict. A big example here that I use all the time with grad students is like when you go to grad school, sometimes it means you have to like not go to all the family functions and you can't take the family vacation or you can't do what you wanted to do because you have grad school and something pertaining to grad school. That doesn't mean you don't value your family. And if you choose to go on the holiday and miss a class, that doesn't mean you don't value graduate school, right? So there's things like that in a clinical context that like I can value, my independence and value my family. And if my family doesn't like my independence, well, those two things can be true and they can still be important for me.
Okay, another question is how do you go about getting clients to buy into ACT? My experience with clients is that they are very hesitant or skeptical about trying something like this.
Yep. That is a really good question. And yeah, I mean, I think that with like all forms of intervention, right? It's like talking about informing them about what it is. If it doesn't work, kind of getting them off of it. I have had some clients present similarly where we have whole sessions where I'm just like, yeah, I know, isn't it weird? Yeah, I know it's weird. What's weird about it? How do you feel when I'm asking you to like, talk about something you don't want to talk about? And acknowledging when they say no. One of the things that the other way that I've done this is they may not be ready for like full-blown, values work or like experiential exercises, but maybe we can just hang out and shape up a mindfulness-based repertoire. So can we just sit and breathe and notice what that's like? Maybe if I know they have a history of trauma, I'm not going to ask them to close their eyes, but can you just maybe like set your gaze downward, or can we just like sit in a space and smell the smells, feel the feels, just stay in the moment? Sometimes starting small is helpful. And thinking about behavioral interventions, we don't like push people right into the end without any kind of prereq or some type of support building before then. So if you notice that, maybe that would be a cue to kind of come back, building rapport and starting small with some of those present moment repertoires.